Hello, I'm Herman Eberhardt, the Supervisory Museum Curator at the Franklin Roosevelt Presidential Library and Museum, and I want to welcome you all to this first installment in a new series of programs featuring conversations between me and curators at other presidential libraries. In this series, we're going to be exploring the various jobs and roles of museum curators. And today we'll be talking about one of the most important and complicated jobs of a curator, developing new museum exhibits. The curators at all of the presidential libraries operated by the National Archives are responsible for presenting new changing exhibits on special topics on a regular basis in their museums. They also make periodic alterations to their museum's larger permanent exhibits to reflect changing scholarship or to incorporate new technologies. But there's one task so complex, so costly, and so time-consuming that it's usually undertaken by presidential libraries only once every 15 years or more. I'm talking about the complete rethinking and replacing of the museum's entire permanent exhibit. Here at the Roosevelt Library, we completed a full redo of our entire 12,000 square foot permanent exhibit in 2013. And joining me today to discuss how these kinds of projects are done is Clay Bauske, the Supervisory Curator at the Harry S. Truman Presidential Library and Museum in Independence, Missouri. Clay and his team at the Truman Library are currently in the final stages of completely redoing their entire permanent exhibit. So welcome, Clay. I know that you're in the thick of things right now with your project. Where do things stand right now, and what is your projected opening date for the new permanent exhibits?
Well, Herman, we are probably within 2 months of having the exhibits, our new exhibits, done and ready to open. The big question, of course, with all the libraries is when will the libraries actually open to the public? Mm-hmm. So we're not really sure about that, but the actual work on our new permanent exhibits, we're probably within 2 months of being done with them.
Mm-hmm. So the exhibits are being installed as we speak?
Yes, all of the essentially all of the general construction in our museum, we went in and had contractors literally rip out everything in the museum and then start from scratch. That included installing all new walls in the exhibit areas. We actually constructed a 3,500 square foot addition to the building, which I can get into a little later, the function of that. That work is all essentially done now, and the exhibit fabricators are now installing the exhibit panels, the graphics, and that kind of thing. We haven't started really installing the artifacts in the exhibit. That'll be the very last thing that'll happen. That probably won't start for another month or so. Yeah.
That's great. Sounds like a very exciting moment in the project. There are a lot of things that I want to discuss about your new exhibits and the process of what goes into rethinking and remaking a museum's permanent exhibition. But I thought we could start today by talking a little bit first about our two museums and what they were like when they were created back in the 1940s and 1950s. Because an important thing about museums is they aren't static. You know, they naturally evolve and change over time as their audiences, historical interpretations, and exhibit technology changes. So when FDR, I'll start with FDR, when FDR created the National Archives' first presidential library here in Hyde Park, he included a museum in his plans. And when that museum opened in June 1941, it was very different from the museum today. I think since FDR was a sitting president at that time, starting his third term in office in 1941, he didn't think the museum had to be about him since he was such a familiar public figure. Instead, he filled the museum with his personal collections. FDR was a lifelong collector of all kinds of things, ranging from coins, stamps, and art to ship models, rare books and manuscripts, and artifacts related to naval and maritime history. It was a long list of things that he spent a lifetime collecting. And so those were the things that were in the museum in its early years. It was really only after FDR's death and in the ensuing decades, as the public's memory of him began to fade a bit, that things began to change. And you started to see exhibits about his early life and his presidency. And then in the 1970s, exhibits were added about the life and career of Eleanor Roosevelt. So today, our museum is very different in terms of what you see and the kinds of stories it tells. So Clay, I'm wondering, do you see anything similar in the way that the museum at the Truman Library has evolved since its founding?
Well, I think there are a lot of similar things, but there are also some things that are very different with the history of the Truman Library. The similar things are that the main thing is Truman really liked the idea that Franklin Roosevelt had created a museum, and then, you know, the papers, his papers, were then turned over to the federal government. The main difference mainly is that, of course, Franklin Roosevelt died in office. So Harry Truman is the first president to actually, you know, in his post-presidential years, actually be at his presidential library. And as a matter of fact, of all the succeeding presidents, Truman spent more time by far at his library than any other president. And he treated it basically as his daily office. He was here on site 5 to 6 days a week. So the early years of the library were, he was really directing what was going on here. Now, his vision for the Truman Library was to not to create a museum about Harry Truman, but to create a museum that would illustrate the jobs of a president. What does a president do? He believed very much in educating people, and especially younger audiences, about the roles of a president. And one of the early exhibits here was called The Six Jobs of a President, which was based on a speech he gave in 1959 at Columbia University. Then from there, Truman spent nine years basically here, worked in his office 5 to 6 days a week. But after he left and after he passed away, the library really didn't change for 40 years. What was here in the library was a series of sort of disjointed exhibits, some really good exhibits, but they had no connecting theme. There were exhibits of state gifts and other temporary exhibits of various kinds. So it was 40 years. It wasn't until the late 1990s that a concerted effort was made to create new permanent exhibits that would tell the story of the Truman presidency, as well as the story of the presidency as a whole.
It's interesting. In both cases, the museums have strayed from the original vision that the president had for it. But that's, I think, a necessary thing, because as time goes by and these figures fade into history, and memory of them fades, it's important then to begin to tell the stories of their lives and their presidencies in these galleries for the public.
Right. In fact, if Harry Truman were to walk in the door today, I'm not sure what sort of reaction he would have to exhibits today, because, of course, he did not want these exhibits to be about Harry Truman. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And it becomes inevitable once a president leaves office, or especially once he passes away, that people want to know about what his administration was about. So, yeah. Our exhibits now are what we call our permanent exhibits, which is a misnomer, of course, as you very well know, because nothing is permanent. We hope we can change them every 15 to 20 years or so. But the first permanent exhibits were created here starting in the late 90s and into 2001. And now we're doing our second complete redo of the museum, redoing those first, what I would call permanent exhibits, and rejiggering the Truman story to meet new audiences.
So let's talk about the process of taking a fresh look at a museum's entire permanent exhibit and completely remaking it. This is something that is, I think, cloaked in mystery for most people out there in the public who see a brand new exhibition open and wonder, how did they ever get from an empty gallery space to this finished exhibit? And I think the first thing to know is that these things take a long time to create. When we embarked on our project to redo the permanent exhibits at the Roosevelt Library, they opened in 2013, but the process of doing that really was about 5 years total, from the original planning sessions through the design and to the final installation and opening of the exhibits. What was the time frame for the project that you're now coming to fruition with later this year?
Yeah, that sounds about it's about the same amount of time. It'll be about 5 years. Once the exhibits are done, it'll be about 5 years since we started the planning process. And in addition to the planning, I mean, you've got the design work and the storyline and all of that. But another, I mean, a very important component is that these exhibits are generally created not by, not as part of the federal government, but by the library's private support foundation. In our case, it's the Harry S. Truman Library Institute for National and International Fairs. And they had to raise the money to do our new exhibit. So that takes time too. And you've got to have a coherent statement of the purpose. You've got to get people excited to donate to the project and so forth. So in our case, the design and the fundraising kind of went hand in hand, and it couldn't have been done in any shorter a period of time, because in addition to the design and so forth, you've got to make sure the money is in hand to do it.
Yeah. Now, these things always have, I think, a longer time frame, both for fundraising and for creating them than I think maybe people often think. I want to talk about some of the key elements that go into this whole process. And I think one thing right off the bat is understanding your audience and understanding the needs of your audience. In our case, and you may have had a similar experience, we recognized that our audience was changing. Like you, I'm sure we draw from a local audience. We also have regional audience, and people come from across the country, and we have some international visitors. But what stood out for us was that there was a generational thing going on, where the visitors who were adults or young adults during the FDR era were really a shrinking part of our audience. And we were getting people now, much more, a bigger percentage every year, visitors for whom this is history, not something that was their lived experience. And that has really important implications for the way that you tell the story in the museum. I assume that's a similar issue for you at the Truman.
Sure. Years ago, before we did the first round of our renovation in the late 90s, early 2000s, the exhibits prior to that were basically all static exhibits. They're objects and text and, photographs and so forth. It was sort of like a book on the walls, as they say. Well, you can't get by with that. It's been years now where you can't really get by with that. You've got to have more interactivity in the exhibits. You've got to find a way to, the subject that you're dealing with is really interesting to you, but you've got to find a way to pull people in and make it as exciting to them as it is to you already. And so there are always changing techniques in how you deal with that with exhibits, and we have changed. As I know you have too.
Yeah, and I think it's also more context is needed. I mean, I think we realized that we needed to put a lot more information in about just what was the Great Depression and what was World War II for younger audiences, to give them the context they needed in order to understand why President Roosevelt matters, why he was important. And in a way, in doing that, the museum becomes not just a place where you learn about President Roosevelt and Mrs. Roosevelt, but you also learn a bit about the 1930s and the 1940s. They become museums of those periods in our history as well.
Yeah, that's very true. And I know you remember, because you helped us with the exhibit that we did in the 1990s and 2000, when we did that round, we had to tell more about the period. So the exhibit we did then was probably as much about what's going on in the country to set the stage as it was about Truman himself. And we're doing the same thing now, even more so, because we've got, the people who come in today are farther removed from the time period and really so many of them don't even know Harry Truman was. So you do have to set that stage and put it in context and tell the story that way. So it's not just simply a story about he was president from X to Y, and here's what he did, and so forth. You really have to make people understand what the world was like at the time.
Yeah, and I think it's important that they understand the context. That's key for understanding the world in which these presidents operated. I think a related thing that we're always very conscious of here, and maybe you've had the same experience, is that it's very important to layer the experiences in the galleries so that you can meet people who have different interest levels. Visitors come with different agendas. Some are intensely interested, some have a marginal interest, and some just are looking just to have a very brief encounter in the museum. And what we try to do is to make it accessible to people of different interest levels, so that we can serve all those audiences.
Right, and I think the other thing that people need to understand about a museum exhibit is there's no way a museum exhibit can cram all the information in that is really, you can't put all the information in an exhibit. The thing we always hope to be able to do is get people interested enough in the subject that they'll go home and check out books from the library or do more internet searching about the subjects and kind of dig down into the parts of the story that they like the most. And also the other thing about that is I think it's very important to make people understand how the decisions made during our respective presidencies, yours Roosevelt and ours Truman, how the decisions made back then by those presidents are still affecting everybody today. We go out of our way to make sure that the exhibits kind of include a component so that people understand that, Harry Truman may have made a decision about X or Y, but that's not the end of the story. It's still affecting us today. And I think that making those connections, why, when a visitor comes in, they ask, why is this important to me? Well, it's because you're still living in a world where the decisions made back then have an effect on your life.
Yeah, I agree. It's vitally important to make those connections to today, so that people can become more engaged with the subject. And it's striking a balance. You mentioned earlier the old expression, an exhibit is not a book on the wall. That's very true. It's not the same kind of experience. First of all, people experience it standing. Sometimes they're sitting in a theater or in a space, but they're largely standing. So they're experiencing history in a very different way than when you sit down in a comfortable chair and read a book. And we need to always be aware of this. So curators are central, obviously, to the process of doing exhibits. But the curator, and this is another thing I think it's interesting to sort of let people in on the process, the curator is really only a part of a larger team of experts and specialists in many different areas who come together on these projects. We've been sort of alluding to that a bit up till now in this conversation. But modern exhibits are complicated things. In addition to artifacts and documents, there's film, sophisticated touchscreens, audiovisual experiences, immersive environments. And these involve the work of a whole range of people, exhibit designers, filmmakers, architects, AV hardware and software specialists, lighting designers, editors, sound specialists, on and on. And the curator has an interesting role in the midst of all that. I wonder, Clay, if you could talk a bit about what it's like to work with this kind of diverse team of specialists.
Yeah, it's true. It takes a really large team of people with lots of different kinds of expertise. I would define the role of the curator in the process is the curator is the person who needs to define the story. What is the story? What's important about the topics we're going to deal with? What is the takeaway from the museum? And then from there, you bring in other people and they help flesh out the story, and they provide their expertise. The audiovisual archivist says, hey, I've got these a dozen photographs and 6 films and so forth that will help illustrate that idea or that topic. And the archive staff they'll come in, and their contribution is basically, yeah, we've got these papers Truman signed, or the letters he wrote, or something that illustrate topic Y. And so the curator's role is basically say, here's the story we want to tell. Now help us figure out how we tell it in a very compelling and visual way. And that's sort of where you bring your team together. And as you mentioned, Herman, it's not just a very important role of archive staff and AV staff and so forth. But when you bring in a team to help design the exhibit itself, you need people who are experts at the latest technologies and the latest graphic design, various parts of fabrication and installation, people to help with all sorts of tasks in putting the various pieces of the exhibit together. But in my mind, it all starts with the story. The starting point is, what is the story? What's the compelling thing we want to tell?
Yeah, I completely agree with your description of what the proper role of the curator is in all of this, and I think that it is all about getting the story right and telling the story well, or the stories, if you want to put it in the plural. I think it's interesting, in the old model of museums, history museums, they were very collection driven. It was, how can we find ways to put all these things from our collection out on display? And now the philosophy is much more, what is the story or stories you want to tell, and then pick objects and documents that help you tell that story. So it's the story that's driving the experience, not the trying to get every single artifact that you can into the displays. One of the things that we had to grapple with at the outset, and it's an interesting question, and I'm going to tell you how we worked it out, and then I'm curious to know the approach you're taking, is where do you start the story? Again, keeping in mind that our audience is changing and that there are more people coming in the building now who need some sort of introduction to the time period in order to fully understand the importance of the president and First Lady and what they were doing. We went back and forth a lot on this, but in the end, what we decided to do was to actually start our exhibit at the depths of the Great Depression, to sort of plunge you into the state of the country and the world in 1932, at the low point of the Depression, when FDR is running for president. And we take you then through that process of his election and right up to his inaugural. And it's not until after he's inaugurated as president that we then step back and tell you the story of, well, who is this man who's been elected to lead the nation in this great moment of crisis? What's the story of his life prior to this? And then we go back and we look at his early life and his early political career, and we work our way all the way back to that same moment of the inaugural. And then from that point on, we take you through his presidency, and it becomes a narrative that follows a storyline that's moving forward in time. But we did all that. We did this business of sort of front loading the story and then moving back in time, because we wanted to be sure that the audience coming in the front door knew immediately that the nation was facing a tremendous crisis at this particular moment when Roosevelt was elected. And once they understood the scale of the crisis, both nationally and internationally, then they'd be more interested in learning about, well, who was this guy who grew up in Hyde Park and entered politics and eventually is running for president in 1932. So that was a big decision that was made very early in the process that then really dictated a lot of what we did subsequently. I wonder, as you were looking at the big picture at the beginning, thinking about how you wanted to start off your permanent exhibit, what were the things you were thinking about, and how did you finally come to a decision?
Well, ironically, we used very, very much the same approach. We talked about early on, well, do we want to do a chronological approach, start with Harry Truman's birth and his background and so forth. And then we realized, there really is a real thing called museum fatigue. And we figured if we started at the beginning and then worked chronologically, people would get tired right about during Truman's first year in office. So we looked for the dramatic moment, just like you did. You looked for the dramatic moment at the depths of the Depression. Well, the dramatic moment for Harry Truman is the day Franklin Roosevelt died, April 12th, 1945. And suddenly Truman is thrust into the office of the presidency. And nobody really knows who he is. Franklin Roosevelt had been president for, the full adult lives of many people at the time. And there were very few people who really knew who Harry Truman was. So we start with a dramatic theater, walk-in theater presentation with wall to ceiling, floor to ceiling videos that thrust people right into the middle of World War II, with battles going on all over the world and so forth. And then suddenly there's the news headline that Franklin Roosevelt is dead and Harry Truman goes into office. And then you're left with this big question. We use quotes from people at the time, but it's something that we hope that people will understand, is that the next thing they say is, well, my goodness, who is president now? And Harry Truman, who is this guy? He was only vice president for 82 days. And he was a senator from Missouri before he became vice president. So we leave that theater with the question, who is Harry Truman? And was he up to being president? What was it? What in his background can make you believe he would be capable of being president? Because many people didn't think obviously he couldn't fill Roosevelt's shoes. So at that point, they walk out of the gap of that theater, and then we take them back to where Harry Truman came from, his background in Missouri, growing up in Missouri, his experience in World War I, the things in his life that maybe gave him some of the leadership abilities that he would have to use later as president. And then we bring you back, after we've done his background, we bring you back to the presidency and his first 4 months of presidency, which were probably certainly one of the most dramatic 4-month periods of any president in history, ending the war in Europe, ending the war in Japan, using the atomic bomb. And it's such a dramatic first 4 months of his presidency that itself brings you back into the drama of the moment.
Well, I think it sounds like a great way to open too, and I think it just grabs people by the throat right away. It's interesting. You mentioned about the theatrical experience that you have at the very beginning, and we have a similar thing in the entry area that deals with the Great Depression. We also put people in a small theater where there's a very dramatic presentation of visually of the crisis that's going on nationally and internationally. And that raises the question of audiovisual elements. They play a big role in modern museums, modern history museums. And I think they're very effective, but they need to be used in effective ways. I think sometimes AV can get in the way of the story, and other times it really helps to tell the story in a particularly vivid way. But there are other places I know in our museum, and I'm curious to know about yours, where we have used film, I think, very effectively. One of the areas that I think it really works very well for us is when we talk about polio and the impact it had on FDR. He's stricken with polio at age 39. He becomes paralyzed from the waist down and remains paralyzed from the waist down for the rest of his life. It's a critical moment in his life. It's a critical theme and subject in his life from that point on. And we do have a very poignant displays of his braces and some documents that relate to polio, but it's a film that accompanies that really gives you a very powerful emotional connection to the story. It's a short film. It's about 6 minutes long, but it takes you through the story of experienced the polio attack, became paralyzed, and what it took for him to rebuild his body, to be able to overcome the depression that he felt, and to ultimately re-enter politics. So that was one instance where I think film had a way of telling the story that really added value to the experience for our visitors. Is there a particular place, or even more than one place, where you found that film helped you to tell the story in a very effective way?
I think so. I could mention a number of places, but we've got a theater that we call in-house. We call the Rubble Theater because you walk into this room and it's basically the ruins of Europe, and video projection is done on the walls, and it talks about the post-war Europe and the challenges that Truman faced. So that's kind of a theater experience. But I would think probably the centerpiece of our entire exhibition is just after World War II has ended. The atomic bomb has been dropped. The war is over. You turn a corner in the exhibit, and what you see is this room with this enormous 14-foot globe. It's a three-dimensional globe that's 14 feet tall. And what we've done on it is the globe has actual cracks in it. And the idea is this is the world that Harry Truman faced immediately after World War II. And the idea is that there are crises taking place all over the world because the world is devastated from the war. And what we've done is we've got video projections, repeated silent video projections that are projected on the surface of this globe that show conditions in various countries all over the world. So it's a very impressionistic sort of thing, but it shows people that, okay, World War II was over, but that was only the beginning of the challenges that Truman had to face. Here's a world that's just devastated from the war, and he's got to deal somehow with crises that are happening all over the world. So that's in the center of the room. The globe is in the center of the room, and then around the outside of the room, we have exhibits that sort of deal with some of the programs and policies that Truman initiated to deal with some of those things. For example, the Truman Doctrine and the Marshall Plan. And other acts and efforts that were taking place. So that's a use of audiovisual that's not a traditional theater setting, but it's to create the impression, we hope, for visitors that, even though the war is over, the challenges all around the globe are enormous. And, what is it that Truman can do to deal with those? The other thing we use our theaters for example, we've got a theater relating to Truman's decision to recognize Israel in 1948. And what we try to emphasize there and in other places in the exhibit is that presidents have to make very difficult decisions. And some of them are not cut and dried. Some of them are decisions that, he just has to buckle down and decide what he's going to do. And so we use an AV presentation in that theater to sort of illustrate the conflict within the Truman administration about whether or not Truman should formally recognize the new state of Israel.
Those sound really great, Clay. I can hardly wait to see these new exhibits. It's interesting. The use of immersive environments, spaces that you come into and you're surrounded by, is really effective in helping to convey messages. On a smaller scale, we do it in a couple places in our museum by recreating rooms, period rooms. And the reason we did that was we wanted to have visitors experience how Americans in the 1930s and 40s would hear FDR on the radio, which was the great mass medium of the 1930s and 40s. There was no television at that time. So generally speaking, if people were going to have a first-hand experience with the president, it was through the radio and his famous fireside chats. So what we did was we created a space that sort of recreated the kitchen of a struggling family during the Great Depression. And in the room, there's a a small cathedral-style radio seated there on the table. And you can sit down in this kitchen, and by pressing a button, you can listen to a portion of one of FDR's fireside chats coming out of that radio and get the same experience that people would have had in the 1930s of hearing him talk about particular issues or legislation that he's trying to get passed. And then when you're finished hearing that excerpt, you can actually push another button, and you can actually hear actors reading actual excerpts from letters that were written to the president by the public in response to that speech. So you're actually hearing their voices as well. And we took care to include both people who were positive about what FDR was saying and were supporting him, but also a fair number of people who disagreed with the president and were making their feelings very, very clear in their letters to FDR. I want to turn to a different aspect of what we do in our museums, and that's how we integrate the story of the First Lady into the exhibition. This was another big question for us as we started off our project. Eleanor Roosevelt was so completely involved in so many aspects of FDR's New Deal and a lot of the things that were going on during World War II. She's a very active First Lady, really sets a new standard in terms of what the First Lady's role is. And in the older museum, the one that we were revising, there had been a separate gallery for Eleanor Roosevelt. It was a First Lady's gallery. And when we were looking at redoing the permanent exhibits, we decided that didn't make much sense to us, having her off in a separate place, because she was so closely involved in so much of what was going on in FDR's presidency. So we took a very different approach. And instead of having a separate Eleanor Roosevelt gallery, we have her appearing throughout the exhibition in various ways. And she's seamlessly woven into the story as she was in reality. When we did this, I think, we were taking a chance because admirers of the First Lady, liked the fact that we had a separate First Lady gallery, and we had to convince them that we could do it in a way that would actually enhance her role in the museum. And we were very pleased when we reopened the new permanent galleries in 2013 that people were very happy with the way we had integrated Eleanor into the story rather than having her off in a separate gallery. How do you handle First Lady Bess Truman in your new exhibits that you're going to be opening?
Well, that's a great question, Herman. And we also struggled with this question. Do we devote a gallery to Bess Truman, or how do we deal with Bess Truman? And of course, when you start at the beginning, there could not have been a bigger difference between Eleanor Roosevelt and Bess Truman in terms of their public persona. Eleanor Roosevelt, of course, was everywhere. She really defined a new role for the First Lady. Bess Truman didn't want to be that. She was a very private person. She was a very family-oriented person. And in addition to that, just as an aside, for 3.5 years of the Truman presidency, the Trumans didn't even live in the White House because it was being renovated. And so they lived in the Blair House across the street, which is a very small space. So they didn't do a lot of entertaining. Also, early in the presidency, just coming out of World War II, there also wasn't much entertaining in the White House because it was seen as sort of bad taste early on to be doing a lot of entertaining just immediately after the war. So Bess Truman didn't want to do any entertaining, and there were these occasions when there wasn't an opportunity to do entertaining. But what was Bess's role? If she was no Eleanor Roosevelt, but what was her role? And the fact is that her role was as a personal confidant and supporter of Harry Truman. And the strong part of our collection is we have a series of more than 1,300 handwritten letters that Harry wrote to Bess over their lifetimes. That's the good news. The bad news is we have fewer than 200 letters that she wrote to him. And the reason for that is she burned her letters. She didn't want the public to know what she was saying to Harry. She missed about 200 of them, so we do have just under 200 letters. They would write letters to each other almost every day, sometimes more than one a day. So they were very close. We do know that she had a really strong behind the scenes influence on Harry Truman. They would discuss things in the evening and so forth. So she was not necessarily a policy person, but she was reading people, and she would advise Harry about people. So this is a very private woman. And so it just seemed to us that it would not make sense to have a separate gallery for her, because what we would have to do there is do everything that Bess Truman didn't want to do. She didn't want to be public. She didn't do a lot of entertaining. She didn't like entertaining. But what we did have is this really personal correspondence, so we can see her role behind Harry Truman all the way through his career. So we try to weave that throughout the exhibit. The personal, if Harry Truman is dealing with issues that we show in the during his presidential years, we try to also show letters that he's written to her, so you can see that she was giving him suggestions and advice and just being supportive. But it made more sense to weave it throughout the exhibit than it did to do a separate gallery for Bess Truman.
We've been talking a lot about immersive environments and AV and sort of things of that sort in exhibits. Of course, there are a lot of documents and artifacts. We certainly have a lot of that in our museum, and I'm sure you will too. And a question I very often get from visitors is, what's your favorite artifact in the museum, or what's your favorite document? And I do have my favorites, and I'm sure you do too. I just thought it'd be fun to at least mention a few of those here during this program, because we're curators and we cover a lot of ground, but we have our favorites as well. In my case, I love the fact that we have the original Oval Office desk that FDR used, and the chair, and also all the items that he used to keep on top of the desk. And we have Harry Truman to thank for that, because after FDR's death, he gave the desk to Eleanor Roosevelt, and that's not a usual thing. You don't usually see White House furniture leaving the building. I mean, we speculate that Truman just didn't feel right sitting at that desk, knowing that it had been used by FDR for 12 years. In any case, he gave it to Eleanor, and she then gave it to the library. So we're one of only two presidential libraries, the other being the LBJ Library, that actually have the actual desk that was used by the president. The other artifact that I really love is a very, very different kind of artifact. It's much lighter in tone. It's the giant model of the Sphinx that was given to FDR at the 1939 dinner of the White House Press Organization. It's a striking likeness of him as the Sphinx, including his trademark cigarette holder. And it's a wonderful device, not just because it's funny, but it also is a wonderful way to talk about FDR's decision to run for a third term in 1940, because the whole story of the Sphinx sculpture is connected to the fact that he wasn't letting anybody know what his true thoughts were in 1939 about whether he'd run for a third term. In terms of documents, and we have many on display in our permanent gallery, I think the ones that stand out most for me are the original drafts of his inaugural address in 1933, the one, of course, where he made the famous line, "The only thing we have to fear is fear itself," and also the first draft of his Pearl Harbor speech, where he talks about yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy. There are lots of other documents and artifacts in the exhibit, but those are some that stand out for me. I wonder if you could just talk a little bit, Clay, about some of the favorite things that you're going to be putting out on display in your new exhibits.
Well, of course, asking a curator what his favorite object is sort of like asking a parent which is your favorite child. So you can't possibly answer the question. But I will mention a couple. I think the most poignant artifact we'll have on display is At the end of the exhibit dealing with the first 4 months of Truman's presidency, it sort of culminates in this space devoted to the decision to use the atomic bombs on Japan. And we have the safety plug that was removed from the atomic bomb dropped on Nagasaki. And it was removed by the electronics officer after the plane took off. While it was in the air, they replaced the safety plug with an arming plug so that the bomb could be detonated. We have that safety plug on display in a case all by itself, and it's sort of the centerpiece of this room. But it's sort of paired with, in the same exhibit gallery, we have a small paper crane that was folded by a girl who was in Hiroshima when the atomic bomb went off. And she was a young girl, and she eventually developed leukemia from the radiation. And while she was dying, she folded 1,000 paper cranes because that in tradition meant good luck. And we were presented, the library was presented with one of those last paper cranes that she folded. And so we have that in the same gallery as sort of a way to reconcile the end of the war and where Japan and America's relations have gone since. So those are a couple of the most poignant pieces. Of course, one of the most famous artifacts we have is the sign, the desk sign that says "The buck stops here," which Truman had and referred to many times, and so that'll be on display in the exhibit as well. We have 2 of Harry and Bess Truman's automobiles, both 1941 model Chryslers. We have a buggy that came from Truman's farm in 1914, and a lot of other things. We and I know you did this too, Herman, but we have set aside some exhibit spaces in our museum for highlights from our collection. Many people don't really understand or know that the presidents don't just have in their collection things related to their presidency or their life. People gave them stuff all the time. And some of them are really fascinating pieces. We have, and we're going to display some of those in this exhibit area. We have, for example, a 1928 pilot's license that belonged to Amelia Earhart. And it's countersigned by the man who was the head of the predecessor of the FAA. His name was Orville Wright, which you might recognize. And we have a whole lot of other pieces that we'll be displaying there. They aren't necessarily in our regular permanent exhibit, but we do want people to understand that the library's collections are very rich, not just relating to things that happened during the Truman presidency, but may just be gifts that were given to Truman by people all over the country and the world.
I think it's great you're doing that. We as you mentioned, we do the same thing. We have an area where we have people have the ability to sort of look through glass walls into some of our collection rooms and see all the things that are not on display in the permanent exhibit or the special exhibits. I mean, it's interesting. Most museums you go to, well over 90% of the collections are in storage at any given time. So any opportunity we can give people to see some of the other things, I think it's a good thing and interesting for people. In our case, actually, it lets us show you a portion of FDR's ship model collection. We also have on display there, you mentioned automobiles. We have the car that FDR had modified with hand controls so that he could drive it without the use of his legs because of his paralysis from polio. You mentioned, Clay, earlier the atomic bomb, and I think one of the topics I wanted to talk about today is, presidential libraries are sometimes accused of being uncritical of their president and only presenting a positive view of them. At the Roosevelt Library, we directly address issues where historians are very critical of FDR, along with issues where there's ongoing historical debate and disagreement among historians about aspects of his presidency and his legacy. We do this in a number of ways, but one of them is we have a series of touchscreen programs located throughout the galleries that are titled Confront the Issue, where we give people an opportunity to hear about historians talking about topics. You can sample from documents from our own collections that shed light on this, and they cover a whole range of subjects, from what caused the Great Depression, did the New Deal end the Great Depression, FDR's response to the Holocaust, his executive order incarcerating Japanese Americans during World War II, the New Deal in African Americans, where we examine how New Deal programs were often marked by racial discrimination and segregation, the controversies over Pearl Harbor. I mean, these are a whole host of these topics where, again, you hear from the critics of FDR, and you are able to explore documents that shed light on the debate or the topic from history. Are there ways that you're doing similar things in your new exhibits?
Yeah, sure. We are trying to do the same thing. We learned this a long time ago that your exhibits actually gain more credibility if you display the topic warts and all. So we've tried to do that everywhere we can in our exhibit. The whole idea that Truman wasn't qualified to be president when he became president. Most of his decisions had opponents who were very verbally strong about their opposition. We have tried in as many possible cases as we can to display any documentation of that, letters from irate people, the irate father of a soldier who was killed in Korea, and all throughout the exhibit we try to do that. Harry Truman, it was a flawed person, like everybody is. He actually was fairly candid about it himself. So in a lot of his writings, he does talk about not necessarily, he didn't really regret decisions that he made. He sort of made that clear. He just make a decision and then went to sleep afterwards, because once the decision was made, it was done. But we do try to bring out, his critics. His decision to use the atomic bomb, of course, was controversial at the time. It's still very controversial. We have an area where historians and people who lived at the time, quotations from them, highly criticizing Truman for that. And then we also have a comment book where people can actually write their own comments about whether they thought Truman's decision was the right one or not. So we try to do that as many places in the exhibit as we can. Yeah.
Yeah, you mentioned it. I think that people respect and appreciate when you confront these issues honestly and point out where historians have been critical of the president. It's a great way of having points of engagement with audiences. They come sometimes knowing a bit about some of these topics, and they're looking for it. They're hoping that you do address it. And I think we have had really great responses to the aspects of our exhibit where we are presenting critical viewpoints of the president. The last thing I want to talk about today, Clay, is we talked about where you start the exhibit, but how do you end the experience? This is something that we've always, we had a great deal of discussion on our end about how to do this. These stories have an end with the death of the president, but these presidents, and I think especially the ones we're talking about, Franklin Roosevelt and Harry Truman, these were consequential presidents whose presidencies, they're still impacting our lives 70, 80 years later in so many ways. We struggled for a long time with, how to end the story. We cover FDR's death on April 12th, 1945, which is, of course, the beginning of your story. So that's where our two museums intersect for a moment. We actually had two things that we ended up doing. One was I mentioned earlier Eleanor Roosevelt and how she's woven through the whole exhibit. Well, of course, Eleanor continues beyond 1945. She doesn't die until 1962, and in fact has a very consequential career in the 1940s and 50s. Harry Truman, the first American delegation to the United Nations. She's the principal author of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. She's involved in so many issues of the 1950s, civil rights, democratic politics, women's rights. So what we did was, after we cover FDR's death and Truman taking over as president, we have a final gallery where we look at Eleanor Roosevelt's life beyond 1945 and all the amazing things that she was involved in. After that, we have a small theater. What we struggled with, again, how do we wrap up the legacy, not just of FDR, but of Eleanor? And we went back and forth just endlessly about how we were going to end the gallery. And we knew we wanted to have some sort of sit-down theater where you kind of have a final experience, but we didn't know how to do it. And we finally did find a way. Turns out that at the end of the 20th century, famous Americans were asked to comment on who they thought were the most influential 100 people of the century. And Time magazine did this at the end of the century. And Bill Clinton, who was sitting president at the time, wrote an essay for that magazine issue in which he made the argument that Franklin Roosevelt deserved to be in that group. And we read the essay and we realized that Clinton had done a really wonderful job of compressing into a small essay the real lasting legacies of both Franklin and Eleanor Roosevelt. So what we did was we contacted the Clinton Library and asked them if they could check with the president and see if it was okay if we used his essay as a basis for our final theater. And then we actually asked whether or not he'd be willing to narrate it. And the answer on both counts was yes. He was willing to let us use the essay, and yes, he would be happy to narrate it. So what we have at the end of our museum is a theater where you sit down and Bill Clinton narrates in his own words what he thinks the legacies of Franklin and Eleanor Roosevelt are. And it ended up being really effective for us and solved our problem. You have a president, again, the importance to today is so huge. How do you treat the end point after Truman's death? How do you treat the final experience of visitors before they leave?
Yeah, we decided to do what we call our legacy gallery, and it's a kind of a hallway area as you're leaving the exhibition, where we go back and look at a series of issues on sort of a timeline thing. And in the center of the timeline are the decisions that Truman made on these various issues. And then above and below this timeline are actions that other presidents took, either just before Truman or after Truman. For example, Social Security, which of course Roosevelt is prominent in before Truman. Things like Medicare, which Truman had proposed, but wasn't actually enacted until the Johnson administration. So you sort of see these things that are decisions that Truman made, but they aren't static. Presidents before Truman had initiated some. Truman had initiated some, which are still being dealt with today. And we hope to get people thinking about this whole idea that even if a president served 70 years ago, the decisions that president made are still affecting us today. So they walk through that gallery, and we have only one artifact in that whole gallery, and that is this little oval table that was in the presidential suite at the Muehlebach Hotel in Kansas City. Now, when Truman came back on his trips back from Washington while he was president, he had his office basically down at the Muehlebach Hotel, and he had this presidential suite, and he used this little table to sign things on and so forth. And it was on that table that he signed the act that became known as the Truman Doctrine, which provided aid to Greece and Turkey but also became the foundations for providing assistance to countries that were resisting communism. But that table was then given to the Truman Library, and we've had it on display a long time. But in 1965, President Lyndon Johnson came here to officially sign the Medicare Act here at the Truman Library, and he gave the first 2 Medicare cards to Harry and Bess Truman, and he signed that on that table as well. And then in 2000, Secretary of State Madeleine Albright came here and signed what was called the NATO accession. Well, of course, NATO was established during Truman's administration, and Madeleine Albright wanted to recognize Truman for that. So she came out here and signed this thing that added the first 3 new countries to NATO. So we've got that on display in our legacy gallery. It's sort of the legacy of Harry Truman can be seen in the Truman Doctrine, Medicare Act, and this NATO accession. As people exit our museum, then they actually go through a space that deals with Truman's funeral. And then from there, they can access our courtyard where Truman had his office here for years, and also the grave sites where Harry and Bess Truman are buried.
That's great, Clay. That object that you've described is wonderful. I mean, it encapsulates both aspects of his domestic legacy as well as his international legacy. You've got it all in one object that people encounter at the end.
Right.
Well, Clay, I want to thank you for joining me in this conversation about the process of developing new exhibits. And I've got to say, I'm really looking forward to seeing your exciting new permanent exhibition when it opens. So thanks again for joining me in this conversation. And I'll be back again with all of you in a conversation with another presidential library curator, where we'll talk about other aspects of curatorial work. See you all then.